Hello my friends, welcome to the Lulu Blue Studio. Today we are going to spice it up. We are going to paint together these leaves with grapes, in particular using our watercolor set, but also our gouache paints and our inks. We are going to use all of these materials because I want to show you what are the different effects that you can achieve with all of these water-based supplies. But if you only have watercolor paints, just go ahead with those. My name is Luisa and this is the Lulu Blue Studio. Let's start painting together. I like to start painting this watercolor project from the leaves in the upper side of the page. And so I take my flat brush and using mainly the belly and the side of this brush, I mix some orange, some transparent orange with a little bit of red and a touch of brown, and I start to create these leaves. Mainly the base is in transparent orange color, and then I use a little bit of burnt umber and scarlet red to start to add a few brush strokes while the first layer of the paint is still wet. This will allow the brown, the red and the orange to blend while the whole leaf is still wet. And I start to create a second leaf exactly next to the first one. In this case, I mix a little bit more scarlet red, but I use exactly the same approach. The first layer is quite watery. This means that there is quite a lot of water on the paper and on the brush, and the amount of pigment is not that high. While the first layer is still wet, I added a little bit of yellow ochre on one side to give an accent of yellow to this leaf. For this whole composition, I want to give a very warm effect, and therefore I'm using for this leaf mainly warm colors. In the upper leaves, I want mainly to give a red color, and so I'm adding even now some brush strokes in Brilliant Opera Rose, and the second set of leaves that are going to be in the center of this page are going to be in brown, while the lower leaves in the part of this page are going to be in yellow. At this point, I change my brush. I take my round brush in size 6 and using a little bit of burnt umber, I start to create these branches that are going to sort of connect to these leaves and allowing these leaves to hang from the upper part of the page. My idea is that there is this set of branches that are starting in the upper part of the page and that are going to hold all of the leaves in the center part of the page and in the bottom part of the page. So it's going to be a sort of one long branch that connects them all. And now I grab a little bit of Cobalt Violet and Phthalo Blue to start to create a few round circles that are the grapes of this composition. When you are creating these round shapes, remember that you can play removing part of the pigment in the cup of water in order to create different color values for these grapes. You can also play with the wet on wet technique and add to these grapes some more concentrated pigment while these round shaped elements are still wet. So the first set of these leaves is created completely with our watercolor paints. Mainly I created a first layer in warm colors, in orange particularly, and then I added a few brush strokes in burnt umber, scarlet red, and using also a little bit of opera rose to allow these colors to blend while the first layer is still wet. So we use the wet on wet technique. For the grapes, I used Cobalt Violet and Phthalo Blue to create these round shape elements of the grapes, and I created these elements in different sizes. Also, not all of these round elements are completely full of color, but I left a little bit of white spaces from the page underneath. And now, taking my round brush in size 6 from Silver Black Velvet, I started to create these elements that are typical of the grapes. For these details, I like to use the brush from Silver Black Velvet because it's much softer than any other brush that I have, and therefore these elements are going to be a little bit more free, and they will be with a different flow, let's say, compared to what I could do with a brush that is a little bit more stiff. And at this point I take my flat brush and I mix a little bit of transparent orange, a little bit of Scarlet Red, and I start to create the second set of leaves. So the base color of this second set of leaves is quite similar to the first one, but I'm going to use my ink set, and in particular, as you see, I'm adding a little bit of brown ink into the second set of leaves to give it a different color overall. Inks are type of water-based media that are much more watery compared to the watercolor paints that we are used to, and also they are much brighter and they really can shine the composition. And so I wanted to give you this opportunity, if you have inks at your disposal, to see what are the effects that you can obtain when you mix in your first layer of paint some inks. In this case, I'm using some brown ink because I wanted to give to this whole composition a very warm tone, and overall being it in the colors of red, orange, brown and yellow, but of course you can add to your leaves any other color you prefer. You can always mix inks and watercolor paints, and so you don't have to be afraid to use the same brushes and mix them on the same painting. At this point, I take my round brush in size 6, and with the tip of this brush and just a little bit of pressure, I start to create the round shapes for the grapes. You can locate these grapes wherever you prefer. I want to lead the eyes of the observer from the upper part of the page, then to the center, down to the bottom. And therefore I'm locating these grapes in a sort of way that gives a flow to this whole composition for the observer to look at the composition first in the upper part, and then in the center, and then down below. For the lower set of leaves, I'm using lighter colors. I'm mixing mainly some yellow ochre and lemon yellow from my watercolor palette, and then on the first layer I'm adding some gouache. Gouache is a type of water-based medium that is more opaque compared to our watercolor paints. Therefore, when you use gouache, you will see a little bit less the paper underneath. You can use it exactly in the same way as you use your watercolor paints or your inks. In this case, I'm adding these gouache brush strokes on top of the base of these yellow leaves that I've created. In this way, you will notice by the end of this composition, when everything is going to be completely dry, how gouache will look like on these leaves when you add it as a second layer through the wet on wet technique on a first layer of watercolor paints. If you like this video, press like down below, and if you want to support me with the creation of other videos like this one, please subscribe to this channel because it really helps me to create free content for you to watch. Also, I'd like to remind you that you can always download for free the Beginner's Guide to Watercolor Flower Painting, which is an ebook that I wrote for you, where I highlight all the best tips for watercolor painting, and I also speak about supplies, techniques, and I show you how to paint easy flowers. You can download this watercolor ebook, the Beginner's Guide to Watercolor Flower Painting, by clicking on the link in the description down below. At this point, I'm ending this first layer of this painting by adding a few brush strokes for grapes in the lower part of the page, and I'm connecting all the round elements of the grapes to the leaves using my round brush in size 6 from Silver Black Velvet, because this has such a fine tip that I can create very fine lines between the round elements. I really like the flow of this watercolor composition. So the observer can start looking at these leaves and grapes in the upper part of the page, and the eyes of the observer will be led down to the bottom part of the page. This is a technique that I like to use also when I paint flowers, and this is something that I recommend you thinking of beforehand when you are planning any flower composition you are deciding to paint, or any even other botanical subject that you want to paint. And at this point, still using this same brush, I started to use my gouache set to create on my palette a warm color, a mixture of a little bit of yellow ochre with a little bit of red, and I started to use this mixture to create some fine veins onto these leaves. This is a detail that you can add if you like, and also if you don't have any gouache set available, you can recreate exactly the same effect using your watercolor paints. Mainly I wanted to give a little bit more character to these leaves, and therefore I'm using mainly the tip of my brush when I want to create very fine lines, and then I press a little bit more when I want to create thicker lines. Since these lines are created in gouache, these filaments, these veins, are really going to pop when the whole composition is going to be completely dry. You can use any color mixture for these veins in your leaves. You can use the same color as your base. This is my approach. So in the first case, for the first set of leaves, I'm mainly using a mixture that is toward the red color. But you can also mix different colors and create these veins in a completely different color compared to the base of your leaves. For the second set of leaves, to the mixture that I created, I add a little bit of brown, and I create this warm brown mixture to create the veins of the second leaves. I like to space these elements differently. It means that some veins are closer to each other while others are a little bit further from each other. And I also like to highlight with this darker gouache a little bit the shape of the whole leaf. I encourage you to test different colors, to really mix on your color palette different types of pigments and see which colors come out, and have fun trying to add these elements through the wet on dry technique. You can be precise, you can also have fun and keep it everything quite loose, and even add, for example, less elements through the wet on dry technique on your leaves. As always, you can find all the supplies I'm using in the description down below. So if you're curious to know which gouache set I'm using, or which type of watercolor inks, or which type of watercolor paints I'm using, please check the description down below. For the leaves that sit right at the bottom of this composition, I add a few veins using my gouache set, and in particular the yellow color. I'm also defining a little bit better the shape of these leaves, adding a few elements with this color. This is a very relaxing exercise. Adding elements and details through the wet on dry technique is really something that I encourage you to try when you want to relax and really suit yourself. My main goal for this channel is to really create tutorials that are easy to follow, but also fun, and also will allow you to discover different techniques and ideas to paint. So I really hope that this tutorial was able to give you these feelings and also to spark your imagination and give you new ideas to paint. Thank you very much for watching this tutorial. I hope to see you in my next video.